Over 15 a.m., over 150 Russian tanks, BMPs, and APCs roared into the plains near Kupiansk, the final linchpin in Ukraine's eastern defense line. This was not just an attack, it was a statement, a display of mechanized might with the ambition to crush the enemy through sheer numbers and speed. They thought they could break the front, overwhelm the defenses, and roll into the village like a hot knife through butter. But what followed was not scattered resistance. It was a calculated slaughter, measured down to every meter of ground, every heat signature, every track, a painful lesson for Russia in 21st century warfare. This is the untold story of how Ukraine's Su-25s, UAVs, and artillery formed a devastating pincer, turning a massive armored formation into a steel graveyard in mere hours. What happened when the aging attack aircraft dove from the sky? Let's find out. On the strategic road south of Kupiansk, diesel engines roared as over 150 Russian armored vehicles began closing in on Ukraine's defensive line. T-72 and T-90 tanks, BMP-2s, and APCs formed three deep horseshoe-shaped assault prongs, moving in sync, creating a massive mechanized push straight toward the village of Mern, a critical choke point in the region's defenses. From above, Ukrainian reconnaissance drones silently captured footage of the enemy formation spreading out like an iron net, encircling a small infantry stronghold nestled between two tree lines. At Ukraine's forward command post, thermal and visual data streamed in continuously over encrypted channels. A young officer whispered, "They're trying to envelop Firepoint 7. If they break through, we lose the entire right flank." Ukraine lacked enough tanks for a direct counterattack. Only a few Leopard 2s were positioned far to the rear, while most artillery was engaged on the eastern axis. But they had one card left to play, the Su-25 Frogfoot. Those legendary attack aircraft, slow, heavy, outdated, but a nightmare for any armored formation when used at the right time in the right place. The Su-25 didn't fly high like a MiG or fast like a Su-27, but it could skim the ground, hugging power lines and cliffs, gliding just above the enemy before unleashing a storm of rockets, armor-piercing bombs, and 30mm cannon fire. An Air Force lieutenant colonel stood up from the radar screen and tapped the table. Not a single tank is allowed to cross Mern's perimeter. If they reach the village interior, the defensive line will collapse from within. At Forward Airfield Z-21, in the lingering morning mist, two Su-25 squadrons were loaded with S-8 rockets, two Fab 250 armor-piercing bombs, and full ammunition for their twin GSH-32 cannons. Pilots climbed into cockpits, checked warhead locks, and pushed the throttles. At 0432, the jet engines roared through the silence, and the two Frogfoot squadrons shot into the sky like phantoms, low altitude, no radar, relying solely on inertial navigation and military GPS. On the ground, the Russian forces had no idea that a steel rain from the sky was closing in. While they believed they were hunters encircling weak prey, they were the targets, and the first killing blow would come not from the front line but from above the clouds. 0448 a.m. As the Russian formation neared Mern's defensive perimeter, the sky screamed with a piercing sound. The first wave of Su-25 Frogfoots dove straight down from just over 100 meters, slicing through thin clouds like steel blades tearing the sky. From the weapon pods under their wings, dozens of S-8 rockets fired in salvos, shrieking toward the center of the armored formation. Each rocket, weighing 11 kg, with an armor-piercing warhead, tore through BMP hulls and ripped apart the thin armor of T-72s without reactive plating. Vehicles burst into flames in clusters, black smoke billowing like columns from a hellish forge. Before they could react, at least 15 vehicles were disabled within the first 3 minutes. One T-72 took a rocket to its side, its turret popping off like a tin can lid. A BMP exploded as infantry inside couldn't escape the troop compartment. The sound of explosions echoed off the hills, shaking the entire area. The Russian mobile command post positioned at the formation's center quickly became the next target. The Su-25 circled for a second pass, this time dropping Fab 250 M62 bombs, upgraded with armor-piercing warheads and semi-active guidance. One bomb landed squarely on the command area, where two communication vehicles had set up antennas. The blast incinerated the vehicles, severing internal coordination signals. The Russian formation, advancing in its horseshoe shape, was instantly split into three parts. The forward armored prongs lost directional orders, while units in the rear were blocked by burning vehicles across the road. On the ground, Ukrainian artillery joined the fray. From behind a ridge 6 kilometers away, M-Staff B-152mm howitzers fired indirectly at retreat routes, pre-marked by drones. Continuous shelling churned up earth and stone, obscuring visibility and preventing armored vehicles from turning back. In the air, PD-2 reconnaissance drones circled silently, streaming real-time imagery to the coordination center. The fire control system instantly updated the positions of surviving Russian vehicle clusters, attempting to regroup. Russian crews began to panic. Manpads were hastily deployed from Ural trucks in the rear, but without commanders they lacked coordination. An Igla missile was launched at an Su-25, climbing after an attack run, but the Frogfoot slipped through a low valley, switched off signal lights, and vanished behind a cliff. Radar detected nothing. Engine heat was masked by terrain. The Igla went astray, crashing into a barren hillside. The second wave of Su-25s arrived. 3 freshly refueled Frogfoots from the forward base dove to strike the Russian left flank, where nearly 40 vehicles, including at least 12 tanks and 4 ammunition carriers, were concentrated. No air defense orders remained. The Su-25s closed in from both flanks, firing all rocket pods simultaneously. Volleys of S-8 rockets rained down like a steel hammer, triggering chain explosions. An ammo carrier took a hit, detonating and taking out a row of nearby vehicles. Simultaneously, from a distance, Ukraine's Grad BM-21s fired from pre-positioned spots in a pine forest. Over 40 122mm cluster rockets targeted the Russian right flank, blanketing the mechanized infantry and logistics vehicles staging area. The hill turned into a sea of fire. Vehicles exploded one after another. Infantry abandoned weapons and scattered in all directions, only to face follow-up artillery barrages. In less than 20 minutes from the first strike, nearly 50 Russian vehicles were knocked out. The coordination of airstrikes, artillery, drones, and real-time targeting showed this was no ordinary raid. It was an organized annihilation, calculated step by step. Ukraine didn't react. They set a massive trap from the air, and Russia drove its entire armored force straight into the jaws. 05:24 a.m. The first light of dawn spilled across the fields, illuminating trails of black smoke curling from dozens of smoldering tank wrecks. Ukrainian reconnaissance drones circled at low altitude, scanning the area with infrared sensors, displaying lingering heat signatures on screens, tanks, trucks, and groups of infantry hiding in newly formed shell craters. Data streamed live to the coordination center, with each target marked, each movement tracked like a predator's map. Immediately, Su-25 Frogfoots dropped below 50 meters, engines growling like iron beasts, chasing those glowing dots. Pilots locked onto lone T-90s, especially targeting logistics vehicles, fuel tanks, ammo carriers, medical kits. A truck carrying 125mm shells was hit by a salvo of S-8 rockets. The blast hammered the ground, spreading to 3 nearby tanks, shredding their armor and carving fire pits deep as volcanic craters. A smoke column rose over 70 meters, blotting out the horizon. Russian self-propelled artillery tried to counter from afar, blindly firing at Ukraine's old artillery coordinates, unaware that satellites and drones had locked their positions after their first salvo. Seconds later, Ukraine's Caesar howitzers returned fire from behind a ridge, precision shells destroying the Russian battery as it reloaded. Air and ground operated like a Swiss watch. Not a beat missed, not a strike off target. A T-80 command tank attempted to retreat, smoke pouring from its exhaust, but a compact FPV drone with a makeshift heat warhead slammed into its windshield like a living bullet. A sharp explosion, flames erupting from the hull, and the tank froze in the field, its turret tilted to one side. The scene became surreal. Drones hounded Russian vehicles like wolves chasing wounded prey, fighting piece by piece until the beast collapsed. No vehicle escaped without being tracked. A BMP sped north, spewing white smoke to obscure itself, but a drone stayed on its tail, dropping a small munition on its turret, then another into its engine compartment. The vehicle stalled and burned. Panicked crews abandoned tanks, running to shell craters or piles of wrecked armor, only to face grenades dropped from above. Meanwhile, Su-25s rotated pilots as planned. At the forward airfield, refueling and rearming machines stood ready. Each aircraft landed, reloaded rockets, and took off again in minutes. After just 28 minutes, the Frogfoot squadrons returned to the smoky battlefield, diving into the chaos before anyone could recover. This rotation created an unrelenting attack rhythm. Every time Russia thought it had survived an airstrike, another squadron appeared on the horizon. By 06:15, the Russian formation had lost nearly 80 vehicles, tanks, BMPs, APCs, with many tank crews abandoned in the fields like stranded whale carcasses. Infantry fled north on foot, discarding helmets, vests, and backpacks to run faster, but reconnaissance UAVs swept through, marking their positions. Precision artillery barrages turned retreat routes into death roads. Some T-90s, still intact, were abandoned with empty ammo racks. Su-25 pilots circled one last time, looking through HUDs at the scene. A steel graveyard taking shape, with Russian soldiers scattered like helpless dots. At this point, Ukraine hadn't lost a single tank. Its entire defensive system remained intact. Artillery kept firing steadily, drones buzzed like divine eyes, and Su-25s continued hunting in the early sky. This was no longer a battle. It was a systematic extermination, methodically strangling an enormous armored formation as it disintegrated in chaos and fire. 0630. Facing the catastrophe of their shredded armored formation under skyborne firepower, Russia's forward command made a final call: muster all remaining forces for a desperate breakthrough. Over 25 armored vehicles, BMP-3s, T-80s, BTR-82As, plus a mechanized infantry company, were rallied into a single assault prong, charging toward Village K west of Mern. This wasn't about capturing ground anymore, it was about saving face, salvaging the battle before total collapse. But Ukraine had anticipated this move long before. No longer needing Su-25s, Ukraine shifted to a new asymmetric warfare model, a heat trap mine drone ambush. Engineer and tactical UAV units had laid thermal decoys, preheated metal blocks placed among trees to mimic hidden tanks. As the Russian armored column entered the area, motion sensors triggered TM-62M guided mines in a chain reaction. Within 90 seconds, 6 vehicles were torn apart by anti-tank mines, tracks flying into the air, turrets flung backward. Smoke and fire engulfed the area, panicking the remaining vehicles into turning back. But at that moment, GMLRS cluster munitions launched from HIMARS 20 kilometers away, blanketed the retreat route. Each missile split into over 180 submunitions, covering an area the size of 2 football fields. BMPs turning to flee were blasted from their roofs, and a casualty evacuation vehicle turned to scrap in seconds. Once again, the Russian formation shattered completely, with no organizational structure left. Surviving soldiers leapt from vehicles, running into the southeastern forest near Village K, believing they could escape. But the forest had been marked by reconnaissance drones 30 minutes earlier. Small drones like Punishers and Lelica 100s, carrying RKG grenades, were waiting. As acoustic and thermal sensors detected footsteps, drones descended, dropping grenades into foxholes, tree hollows, and bushes where soldiers cowered in desperation. Explosions rang out steadily, small fire bursts flaring like the last embers of the assault force. A group of 6 Russian soldiers tried to hold an abandoned house on Village K's edge, barricading it with furniture and setting up a machine gun at the window, hoping to hold out for reinforcements. But they forgot one thing: Javelin doesn't need to see people, it only needs heat. From over 2 kilometers away, a Ukrainian defense unit spotted abnormal heat signatures in the house via infrared drones. A Javelin missile was fired, arcing high before plunging through the roof. The house collapsed like cardboard, everything inside silenced forever. By 0657, the counterattack was over. No sirens, no retreat orders, just the sound of dead engines and crackling fires across the field. Of the over 150 armored vehicles deployed initially, fewer than 30 remained operational, most damaged, tracks stuck, or stranded in mud. Vehicles still running lacked crews or were hunted by drones. A T-90 tried to start and retreat, but crawled only a few dozen meters before getting stuck in another burning wreck. In the sky, the final Su-25 from the initial squadron reappeared. It carried no weapons, just circled once, then quietly banked west, like a farewell. Below, what remained wasn't a battlefield, it was a steel graveyard. Turrets blown off, tracks snapped, half-burned hulls layered in muddy brown earth. One of the largest mechanized assaults in months, obliterated in just over 2 hours. In under 3 hours, over 120 Russian armored vehicles, T-90s, T-72s, BMP-3s, BTR-82As were destroyed or abandoned in the fields, reduced to smoldering steel husks. Nearly 400 soldiers were confirmed as casualties per data collected by Ukrainian reconnaissance drones. Remarkably, not a single Ukrainian base or defensive line was breached, no trench overrun, no village lost to the enemy. The attack ended with none of Russia's strategic objectives achieved. The Su-25 clunky, slow, a Soviet-era relic thought obsolete, became the precise scalpel that carved apart Russia's armored formation. Not because of its own strength, but because of how it was integrated, coordinated by drones, guided by real-time data, backed by precise artillery and smart mine placements. When woven into a modern combat ecosystem, even an old Su-25 could dismantle an entire armored regiment. Russia clung to an outdated mindset: more tanks, easier victory. But that day, in the fields around Mern, that tactic was thoroughly dismantled by a modern destruction network, where every thermal sensor, every reconnaissance UAV, every Javelin and HIMARS crew worked in sync, leaving no gaps. Tanks rolled in long, slow, orderly formations. Ukraine fought as a network, fast, decentralized, with eyes everywhere and strikes from every direction. The problem wasn't the T-90, it's a formidable machine. The fault lay in unchanging combat thinking, in misapplying it to the wrong era. And there, where drones stalked every breath, where HIMARS fired in 30 seconds, every armored vehicle, no matter how advanced, was just a slow target waiting to be erased. not because the vehicles were weak, but because they were sent to a battlefield where their era had ended. If this battle showcased the power of modern warfare, don't forget to subscribe for more analyses. Thank you for following, and see you in the next video, where a lone leopard faces an entire Russian convoy.